Part 1: The Beginning of the End. Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Her hand hovered over the light switch as she debated whether or not to actually look at herself. She'd never been one for bold choices, and this was no exception. The problem wasn't just the mirror, it was the same sense of hesitation that clouded almost every decision in her life. The same uncertainty that had led her to live a quiet, unremarkable existence. She flipped the switch off. Sarah was used to dimming the light in her life. It was easier to exist that way. No expectations, no bold leaps into the unknown, just a small, comfortable bubble where everything was safe and predictable. The problem was, deep down, Sarah had dreams, big dreams. But she buried them under layers of doubt, not allowing herself to reach for them. Today was her 28th birthday, and instead of celebrating with friends, she found herself alone in her tiny one-bedroom apartment. The thought of putting herself out there, of risking embarrassment or failure, was enough to keep her hidden behind the walls she'd built around her heart. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her best friend, Emma. "Come to the gallery tonight. There's someone I want you to meet. Promise it'll be fun." Sarah sighed, feeling the familiar tug of anxiety in her chest. Emma was always pushing her to step outside her comfort zone, but Sarah resisted. It wasn't that she didn't want to live more boldly, it was that she didn't know how. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't even think about bailing. I'll come to your place and drag you out if I have to." Sarah laughed quietly. Emma knew her too well. She thought about what it would mean to go, to say yes, for once instead of hiding away. Maybe this was a chance to finally push through her fear, to take that first step towards something different. With a deep breath, she typed a reply, "Okay, I'll be there." The night air was crisp as Sarah stepped out of her apartment building and made her way toward the art gallery downtown. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel a sliver of excitement. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Emma had always been good at finding interesting events, and a gallery opening seemed like a safe, low-pressure setting to start stepping out of her shell. As she entered the gallery, the smell of fresh paint and wood greeted her. Artworks of all kinds adorned the walls, bold strokes of color, abstract forms, and quiet, moody landscapes. The space was filled with people, talking in low voices, glasses of wine in hand. Sarah scanned the room for Emma but didn't spot her right away. "Hey, there you are." Emma's voice came from behind, and Sarah turned to see her friend approaching with a huge smile. Emma, with her bright personality and outgoing charm, was always the life of the party. "You came." Emma pulled her into a hug. "I knew you wouldn't let me down." Sarah smiled. "Well, I almost didn't, but here I am." "Good, because I have someone I want you to meet." Emma glanced around, then gestured toward a corner of the room where a man stood, talking to a small group of people. "That's David. He's a local artist, and his work is on display here tonight. I think you two would get along." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The idea of meeting someone new, especially someone as interesting as an artist, was both exciting and terrifying. But she'd promised herself she would try, and this was her chance. Emma practically dragged her over, and before Sarah could protest, they were standing in front of David. "David, this is my friend Sarah," Emma said with a grin. "She's a bit shy, but she's one of the most thoughtful people you'll ever meet." David smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. Emma's told me a lot about you." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as she shook his hand. "Nice to meet you too." David had a relaxed air about him, with tousled brown hair and a faint shadow of stubble. He was dressed in a casual yet artsy style, dark jeans and a paint-splattered shirt that spoke to his craft. There was something effortless about him, as if he moved through life with the ease and confidence Sarah had always envied. "So, what do you think of the gallery?" David asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, glancing around. "I love how diverse the art is. There's so much to look at." "I'm glad you like it. I've got a couple of pieces here myself. Would you like to see them?" Before Sarah could answer, Emma excused herself with a wink, leaving the two of them alone. Sarah's heart raced. Here she was, face to face with a real artist, someone who lived boldly, and she was tongue-tied. David must have sensed her nervousness because he gestured toward one of the pieces on the far wall. "This one's mine," he said, leading her over to it. The painting was a swirling mix of colors, bold reds, blues, and golds, crashing together in a dynamic display of energy. It was abstract but captivating, as if the colors themselves were alive. "It's stunning," Sarah said, her voice soft. "What inspired it?" David's smile widened. "It's about taking risks. You know, jumping into the unknown and trusting that things will work out. I guess you could say it's a leap of faith." Sarah felt a jolt of recognition at his words. A leap of faith. That's what she needed in her life, wasn't it? But taking that leap seemed so far beyond her reach. David turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "What about you, Sarah? Do you take risks?" Sarah hesitated, feeling the weight of his question. She could lie, pretend to be someone she wasn't, or she could be honest, for once. "I don't really," she admitted. "I've always played it safe. I guess I'm afraid of what might happen if I don't." David nodded, his gaze steady. "Playing it safe might keep you comfortable, but it doesn't make for much of a story, does it?" Sarah blinked, taken aback by his insight. "I suppose not," she said softly. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. Sarah had always imagined herself as the kind of person who would take bold chances, who would chase her dreams without fear. But the reality was far different. David's voice broke the silence. "You know, I used to be the same way. Afraid of failure, afraid of putting myself out there. But one day, I realized I'd rather fail spectacularly than live a life of what-ifs." His words struck a chord deep within Sarah. Maybe that's what she'd been missing all along, the courage to fail, to try, even if it meant stumbling along the way. Before she could respond, Emma reappeared, interrupting their moment. "Sorry to cut in, but I've got to head out," Emma said. "Sarah, are you okay, getting home?" Sarah nodded, still lost in thought. "Great. David, it was good to see you," Emma said with a smile, before turning to Sarah. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" As Emma left, Sarah felt a strange sense of possibility hanging in the air. David looked at her, his expression open and curious. "I'm going for a walk by the river," he said. "Want to join me?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, a chance to take a small step outside her comfort zone. A chance to say yes. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Sure. Let's go." Part 2, A Walk by the River. The night air had a certain crispness to it as Sarah and David walked side by side toward the river. The city lights glimmered off the water, casting a soft glow across the path. Despite the chilly air, Sarah felt a warmth inside her, a mixture of nervous excitement and the lingering thrill of stepping out of her usual routine. This was new territory for her, and while it was terrifying, it also felt strangely exhilarating. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional sound of water lapping against the shore. It was David who finally broke the quiet. "You know, I wasn't always an artist," he said, his tone casual but reflective. "For a long time, I worked a desk job, corporate stuff, you know? Nothing creative about it. It paid well, but I was miserable." Sarah glanced at him, surprised. "I can't picture you in an office. You seem too free-spirited for that." David chuckled. "Yeah, that's what everyone says now. But back then, I was just another guy in a suit, grinding away at a job I didn't love because I thought it was what I was supposed to do." Sarah frowned. She could relate to that all too well, the feeling of being stuck in a life that didn't quite fit, but not knowing how to change it. "So, what happened?" she asked. David shrugged. "One day, I just couldn't do it anymore. I walked into my boss's office, handed in my resignation, and left. No backup plan, no job prospects. I had some savings, but not much. I just knew I had to start living for myself." Sarah's eyes widened. The thought of quitting a stable job with no plan sounded like madness to her. That must have been terrifying. It was, David admitted. But it was also the best decision I ever made. I took a leap of faith, and somehow, things worked out. I started painting, got into some local galleries, and the rest is history. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't imagine making such a drastic choice. Her entire life had been built around security and predictability. But hearing David's story stirred something inside her. Maybe there was a different way to live, one where fear didn't hold her back. They reached a bench by the water's edge, and David gestured for her to sit. Sarah settled onto the bench, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders as the breeze picked up. "So, what about you?" David asked, leaning back casually. "What do you do when you're not avoiding social events?" His teasing tone was gentle, making Sarah smile despite her nerves. "I'm a copy editor," she said. "I work from home, mostly. It's comfortable, I guess." David raised an eyebrow. "Comfortable isn't the same as fulfilling, though." Sarah sighed. "I know. But it's safe. And I'm good at it, even if it's not exactly exciting." Safe is overrated, David said with a grin. Don't you ever want more than that? Something that really lights you up? His question hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah didn't know how to answer. Did she want more? Of course she did. She'd dreamed of more for years, of traveling, trying new things, meeting new people, but those dreams always seemed so distant, like something meant for someone else. Someone braver. I do, she admitted quietly. But I don't know how to get there. Every time I think about making a change, I just freeze. What if I fail? What if it's worse than what I have now? David nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get that. But you know what? The fear doesn't really go away. You just learn to move through it. Sarah bit her lip, feeling the weight of his words. She had spent her entire life avoiding fear, letting it dictate her choices. But maybe David was right, maybe the key wasn't to eliminate fear, but to push through it. David leaned forward, his gaze steady. Look, I'm not saying you should quit your job and become a painter. But maybe you could start with something small. A little leap, just to see how it feels. Sarah thought about it for a moment. A small leap. Something that wouldn't completely upend her life, but would push her in the direction of her dreams. She glanced over at David, feeling a sense of trust building between them. He wasn't just talking about art or love, he was talking about life. What kind of leap? She asked, her voice soft. David smiled. That's up to you. But maybe it starts with figuring out what you really want. Not what's safe, but what makes you come alive. His words sent a shiver down her spine. What did she really want? It was a question she had avoided for years, but now, sitting by the river with David, she couldn't avoid it any longer. Something inside her stirred, an old desire she had buried long ago. I've always wanted to travel, she admitted. To see new places, meet new people. But I've never even left the country. David's eyes lit up. Then that's your leap. Book a ticket somewhere. Even if it's just a weekend trip. It doesn't have to be far, but it'll be a step toward the life you want. Sarah's heart raced at the thought. Could she really do it? Just book a ticket and go somewhere, without a plan or a safety net. It seemed impossible, but at the same time, it excited her. I don't know, she hesitated. David grinned. What's the worst that could happen? I could get lost, or run out of money, or you could have the time of your life, David interrupted gently. You'll never know unless you try. Sarah fell silent, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was time to stop playing it safe. Maybe it was time to take that leap. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow under the soft glow of the streetlights. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected, hope. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with David. His words echoed in her mind, challenging her to step outside of her carefully constructed bubble. Could she really do it? Could she take that leap, even if it was just a small one? One evening, after a particularly frustrating day of editing endless, uninspired text, Sarah found herself sitting at her computer, staring at a travel website. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she scrolled through destinations, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Just a weekend trip, she whispered to herself. Nothing too crazy. Her eyes landed on a destination, Paris. It was cliché, she knew, but there was something about the idea of strolling through the streets of the city, sipping coffee at a sidewalk cafe, and seeing the Eiffel Tower that made her heart skip a beat. Without allowing herself time to second-guess, she clicked the button and booked the flight. It was done. She was going to Paris. As soon as the confirmation email appeared in her inbox, Sarah's stomach dropped. What had she just done? She couldn't believe it. But at the same time, a sense of exhilaration washed over her. For the first time in her life, she had taken a bold step, one that scared her, but also thrilled her. She texted Emma, her fingers shaking as she typed, "Guess what? I just booked a trip to Paris." Emma's response was immediate, "OMG. Are you serious? That's amazing. I'm so proud of you. We need to celebrate." Sarah smiled. Maybe it wasn't so crazy after all. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Sarah found herself thinking about David. She hadn't seen him since the night of the gallery, but their conversation had lingered with her. He had a way of making her feel like anything was possible, like she could live the life she'd always dreamed of if she just had the courage to go after it. She wondered what he would think when he found out she had taken his advice. Part 3: The Journey Begins. The days leading up to Sarah's trip flew by in a whirlwind of preparations and nerves. She found herself vacillating between excitement and terror, one minute envisioning herself sipping espresso in a quaint Parisian cafe, the next minute imagining herself lost in a foreign city, unable to speak the language. Emma was thrilled for her, constantly texting her links to travel blogs and guides, urging her to embrace the adventure. Sarah had even confided in her parents about the trip. They were surprised, especially given her cautious nature, but ultimately supportive. Before she knew it, the day of her departure arrived. Sarah sat at the airport gate, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched her boarding pass, her stomach swirling with nerves. She had never traveled alone before, let alone to a foreign country. But as she sat there, watching the planes take off, she reminded herself of David's words, "The fear doesn't go away, you just learn to move through it." The flight itself was uneventful. Sarah spent most of it staring out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. Paris. She was really going to Paris. Part of her still couldn't believe it. When the plane finally touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Sarah felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The city of lights was waiting for her, and she was about to step into it, on her own, for the very first time. As Sarah stepped out of the airport and onto the bustling streets of Paris, her senses were immediately overwhelmed. The sound of traffic, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from nearby cafes, the sight of people rushing by with purpose, it was all so vibrant, so alive. She hailed a cab, her heart racing as she fumbled through her limited French to direct the driver to her hotel. The cab ride itself was surreal, the city unfolding before her eyes as they drove through narrow streets lined with charming buildings, their balconies adorned with flowers. When the cab finally stopped in front of her hotel, Sarah felt a wave of relief. She had made it. The hotel was a small, cozy place tucked away on a quiet street, just as she had imagined. After checking in and dropping off her bags, she decided to take a walk. The evening air was cool and crisp, and the streets were bathed in a soft golden light from the street lamps. As she wandered through the streets, Sarah found herself drawn to the sound of music. It was coming from a small cafe nearby, where a man was playing the accordion. The sight was straight out of a movie, a quintessential Parisian moment. She couldn't resist. She slipped into the cafe, found a small table by the window, and ordered a coffee. Sipping her drink, Sarah allowed herself to relax for the first time since arriving. The city had a way of making her feel both small and infinite, like anything was possible here. She watched as people came and went, couples laughing and holding hands, friends chatting animatedly. It was as if the city itself was alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was a part of something bigger. But then, as the evening wore on, her sense of adventure was tested. After leaving the cafe and strolling through the streets, Sarah realized something alarming. She had no idea where she was. Her heart raced as she looked around, trying to orient herself. The street names were unfamiliar, and the landmarks she had seen earlier had disappeared into the darkness. Panic started to creep in. This was exactly the kind of situation she had feared, lost in a foreign city, completely out of her element. She pulled out her phone to check the map, but the battery was almost dead. She had forgotten to charge it before leaving the hotel. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, she considered asking for help. But her French was shaky at best, and the idea of approaching a stranger felt daunting. Taking a deep breath, Sarah reminded herself of why she had come. This was part of the adventure, wasn't it? She couldn't let a little fear ruin it. She scanned her surroundings, trying to remember the way back, and decided to retrace her steps. It took her nearly an hour, but eventually, she found her way back to the hotel, her heart still pounding from the close call. Collapsing onto her bed, Sarah let out a deep breath. She had done it. She had gotten lost in Paris, and she had found her way back. It wasn't the smooth, glamorous adventure she had envisioned, but it was real. It was hers. And in that moment, she felt a small flicker of pride. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sun was already peeking through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. She stretched and smiled. Today was a new day, and after last night's small triumph, she felt ready to take on whatever Paris had in store for her. She had planned a full day of sightseeing, and despite the lingering nerves, she was determined to make the most of it. She spent the morning wandering through the gardens of the Luxembourg Palace, marveling at the perfectly manicured lawns and statues. She strolled along the Seine, stopping to browse the stalls of the booksellers that lined the riverbank. It was everything she had imagined and more. By midday, Sarah found herself standing at the base of the Eiffel Tower. She gazed up at the towering structure, feeling a sense of awe wash over her. It was more beautiful than she had expected, its iron latticework gleaming in the sunlight. Tourists crowded the area, snapping photos and chatting excitedly. For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar tug of discomfort. She was alone, in a sea of people. But then she remembered David's words, "Move through the fear." Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the line for tickets. She was going to the top. As the elevator ascended, Sarah felt her heart race again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was excitement. The view from the top of the Eiffel Tower was breathtaking, the city sprawling out beneath her in every direction. She could see the rooftops of Paris, the Seine winding through the heart of the city, the distant silhouette of the Sacré-Cœur. It was a moment of pure wonder, one she would never forget. Standing there, gazing out at the city, Sarah felt a surge of emotion. She had done it. She had taken the leap, and she was standing here, on top of the world, on top of her world. It wasn't just about Paris. It was about the choices she had made to get here, the risks she had taken, the fear she had faced. It was about the life she was starting to build for herself, one small leap at a time. Part 4: Unexpected Connections. The days in Paris unfolded in a dreamy blur of art, architecture, and adventure. Each morning, Sarah would wake up feeling a little braver, a little more ready to face the world. She visited the Louvre, gazing in awe at the Mona Lisa and wandering through halls filled with masterpieces. She walked through Montmartre, the winding streets lined with artists painting in the open air, and found herself swept up in the bohemian spirit of the neighborhood. But as much as she enjoyed seeing the sights, Sarah realized something unexpected. It wasn't the famous landmarks or the museums that were making the biggest impact on her, it was the small moments, the simple interactions with people. The man who smiled at her while she struggled to order coffee in broken French. The street musician who played a soft melody on his guitar as she passed by. The older woman who nodded kindly at her while they stood in line at the bakery. These small moments reminded her that, no matter how far from home she was, people were the same everywhere, kind, curious, and full of life. On her 4th day in Paris, Sarah decided to do something spontaneous. While wandering through the streets of Le Marais, she noticed a small art studio with a sign that read, "Open Art Class, all levels welcome." Her heart leaped at the thought. She had always been interested in painting but had never pursued it seriously. What better place to try something new than Paris? Without thinking twice, Sarah stepped inside. The studio was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of paint and the soft hum of chatter. A group of people sat at easels, their faces concentrated as they worked on their paintings. A man with a kind face and silver hair greeted her at the door. "Bonjour. Are you here for the class?" he asked with a thick French accent. "Yes," Sarah said, feeling a little nervous but excited at the same time. "I've never done anything like this before." "No problem," he said with a smile. "Art is about expression, not perfection." He led her to an empty easel and handed her a palette of colors. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and trepidation as she dipped her brush into the paint and made the first stroke on the canvas. The instructor moved around the room, offering guidance and encouragement, but mostly he let the students explore their creativity on their own. As Sarah painted, she lost herself in the process. She wasn't sure what she was creating, abstract shapes, swirling colors, blending together like her thoughts and emotions. It didn't matter if it looked good or not. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. She felt alive. After an hour, the instructor came over to check on her progress. "This is wonderful," he said, nodding at her canvas. You have a natural sense of movement and emotion. Keep going. Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had never thought of herself as artistic, but in that moment, she felt connected to something deeper, something that had always been inside her, waiting to be released. When the class ended, Sarah lingered in the studio, looking at the other students' work and chatting with the instructor. Before she left, he handed her a small card with his name and contact information. "Keep painting," he said. "You have something special." Sarah left the studio with a light heart. It wasn't just the painting that had lifted her spirits, it was the realization that she was capable of so much more than she had ever given herself credit for. Later that evening, Sarah found herself wandering through the narrow streets of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, one of the city's most historic and charming neighborhoods. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep shade of blue, the streetlights casting a warm glow on the cobblestones. As she walked, Sarah thought about everything that had happened over the past few days, the risks she had taken, the small victories she had experienced, the way she had begun to see the world, and herself, differently. She rounded a corner and suddenly stopped in her tracks. Standing in front of a small bookstore, flipping through a book, was someone familiar. It was David. For a moment, Sarah was sure she was imagining things. How could he be here, in Paris? She hadn't spoken to him since that night at the gallery, though she had thought about him often. And yet, there he was, as real as the city around her. Feeling a rush of adrenaline, Sarah walked toward him. "David," she said, her voice tentative. David looked up, surprised, and then broke into a wide grin. "Sarah. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing." Sarah laughed, still trying to wrap her head around the coincidence. "I'm here for a few weeks, doing some gallery work," David said, gesturing to the bookstore. "And also doing a bit of writing. Paris has a way of inspiring people, doesn't it?" Sarah nodded, still feeling a bit dazed. "It really does. I can't believe you're here." David's eyes twinkled as he smiled at her. "I can't believe you're here either. How's the trip going?" For the next few minutes, they caught up, Sarah telling him about her adventures in the city, the art class she had taken, and how she had started to feel more like herself in ways she hadn't expected. David listened intently, clearly impressed by her stories. "I'm proud of you," he said after she finished. "You've taken some big leaps." "I guess I have," Sarah said, feeling a sense of pride well up inside her. "And it's been incredible. Scary, but incredible." David chuckled. "That's how the best things in life usually feel." They fell into an easy conversation, wandering through the streets together as if no time had passed. It was surreal. David had been the one to encourage her to take this trip, and now here he was, in Paris with her. As they walked, David stopped and turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah, I've been thinking," he said slowly. "You've come so far in such a short time. But what about when you go back home? Are you going to keep taking those leaps, or fall back into the comfort zone?" The question hit Sarah like a splash of cold water. She had been so caught up in the excitement of her trip that she hadn't thought much about what would happen when she returned. Could she really bring this newfound confidence and boldness back with her? Or would she retreat into her old habits, her old fears? I don't know, she admitted. It's easy to be brave here, in this city. But when I go back to my regular life. David nodded, understanding. It's harder when you're back in familiar territory. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. You've already proven that you can take risks. Now it's about making it a habit. Sarah swallowed, realizing that he was right. It wasn't enough to take one leap and call it a day. She had to keep going, keep pushing herself, even when it felt uncomfortable. Don't let fear control you, Sarah, David said, his voice soft but firm. You're stronger than that. Sarah met his gaze, feeling a surge of determination. She had come this far, hadn't she? There was no turning back now. The rest of Sarah's trip flew by in a blur of experiences, each day filled with new discoveries and small victories. She visited more art galleries, met more locals, and even dared to speak French more frequently, despite her initial hesitations. Every day was a reminder that she could live the life she wanted, if only she allowed herself to. On her last night in Paris, Sarah found herself sitting by the Seine, watching the lights of the city reflect off the water. The Eiffel Tower sparkled in the distance, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This trip had been everything she had hoped for and more. It had shown her that the world was bigger than she had imagined, and that her fears were smaller than she had believed. As she watched the city glow, she thought about the person she had been before she came to Paris, the girl who had been too afraid to take risks, too afraid to live boldly. And then she thought about the person she was now, the girl who had taken a leap of faith, and had discovered a whole new world waiting for her. Sarah knew that when she returned home, things wouldn't be the same. She had changed. She had grown. And she wasn't going to let fear hold her back anymore. Paris had taught her that life was meant to be lived, fully, boldly, and without regrets. It wasn't about playing it safe. It was about taking risks, even when they scared her. It was about saying yes to life over and over again. And so, as she sat there, gazing out at the city that had changed her, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would keep taking those leaps of faith. She would keep pushing herself, keep challenging her fears, and keep living the life she had always dreamed of. Because now she knew she was capable of so much more than she had ever imagined. Part 5: Homecoming and Reflection. The flight back home was filled with a mix of emotions for Sarah. As the plane soared above the clouds, she gazed out the window, the sprawling landscape below shrinking into the distance, and Paris became a memory. Yet, it didn't feel like a closed chapter. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a much bigger story. When Sarah finally arrived back in her apartment, everything felt both familiar and foreign. The same quiet rooms, the same view from her window, but Sarah herself had changed. She had seen something different now, felt something different, and she wasn't willing to slip back into her old ways. The first morning after returning, she woke up early, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The question David had posed echoed in her mind: what will you do when you go back? She stared at her computer screen, where her usual editing tasks awaited her. The thought of returning to the routine that had once seemed so safe now felt suffocating. But this time, instead of pushing those feelings aside, Sarah sat with them. What did she really want? She thought about Paris, about the art class, the walk along the Seine, the thrill of meeting David by chance in the city. She thought about the feeling of freedom, of embracing the unknown. And then it hit her, she wanted more of that feeling in her life. Not just on vacation, but every day. Sarah knew she didn't need to overhaul her life all at once. But she could start small. Just as she had taken that first small leap by booking her trip, she could take another leap here at home. Part 6. A bold decision. The first step was a conversation with Emma. Over coffee at their favorite cafe, Sarah told her about everything she had experienced in Paris, not just the sights, but the deeper changes she had felt inside. "I've been thinking about my life," Sarah said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I don't want to just exist anymore, you know? I want to live. I want to do things that make me feel alive." Emma smiled warmly. "I knew this trip would change you. But I didn't expect it to happen so fast." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted. "But now I can't go back to how things were. I need to keep moving forward." Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. "So, what's the plan?" That was the big question. What was the plan? "I'm not sure," Sarah said slowly, "but I've been thinking about pursuing something creative. I loved that art class in Paris, and I've always wanted to write more. Maybe I could combine the two somehow." Emma raised an eyebrow. "You want to be an artist?" "Maybe not a full-time artist," Sarah said with a laugh. "But I want to explore that side of myself. Maybe take some local art classes, maybe even start a blog where I combine writing and art. It's something I've always thought about, but I never let myself believe it was possible." Emma grinned. "I love it. You'd be amazing at that. You've always had a way with words, and now you're finding your way with art, too." For the first time, Sarah didn't feel a twinge of fear when she thought about stepping into something new. Instead, she felt excitement. It was a small step, but it was hers. Part 7. Building a new routine. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began carving out time in her schedule to pursue her creative passions. She signed up for a local painting class that met once a week and began journaling every morning. But the biggest change came when she finally built up the courage to start her blog. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple site where she posted her reflections on life, art, and the importance of taking risks. She shared some of her paintings and included snippets of her writing, drawing connections between her creative process and the lessons she had learned in Paris. It was a space where she could be herself, unfiltered and free. At first, she wasn't sure if anyone would read it. But to her surprise, people did. Slowly but surely, comments started appearing. Strangers from all over the world, people who had stumbled upon her blog by chance, began sharing their own stories of taking risks and pursuing their dreams. "You've inspired me to start painting again," one comment read. "I had given it up for years, but reading your story reminded me why I loved it in the first place." Another comment came from someone who had booked their first solo trip after reading about Sarah's experience in Paris. "I've always been afraid to travel alone, but your story gave me the courage to finally take the leap." "Thank you." Sarah was floored. She had started the blog as a personal outlet, a way to express her thoughts and document her journey. But now, it was becoming something more. It was connecting her to people, inspiring them in ways she hadn't anticipated. It felt like her small leap had created ripples, reaching people she would never have met otherwise. Part 8: A Leap into Love. One evening, as Sarah was working on a new painting in her apartment, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David. "Hey, how's life? I've been thinking about our conversation in Paris. Let's catch up. Coffee this weekend?" Sarah smiled, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't seen David since that chance encounter in Paris, but they had kept in touch through texts and emails. There was something about him that felt easy and natural, as if he understood her in ways others didn't. They met at a small cafe downtown, and as they sat down with their drinks, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. It was strange, she had spent so much of her life feeling anxious, uncertain about her decisions. But now, sitting across from David, she realized she was exactly where she needed to be. "I've been following your blog," David said, taking a sip of his coffee. "It's amazing, Sarah. You're really finding your voice." Sarah blushed. "Thanks. It's been a journey, but I'm loving it." David leaned forward, his expression sincere. "I knew you had it in you. The way you talked about wanting more in Paris, I could see the spark in your eyes. And now, you're living it." Sarah looked down, feeling the warmth of his words sink in. "I guess I am. But it's not just about the blog or the art classes. It's about everything. It's about choosing to live fully, even when it scares me." David smiled, his eyes softening. "That's the best part, isn't it? Life is scary, but when you embrace it, it's incredible." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the city buzzing around them. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a realization that this wasn't just a catch-up with an old friend. There was something more here, something unspoken yet undeniable. David seemed to sense it too. He reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "You're not the only one who's taken some leaps lately," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about you a lot, Sarah. I don't know where this is going, but I'd like to find out. Together." Sarah's heart raced, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was excitement, a feeling of possibility stretching out before her. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'd like that too." Part 9: Living Boldly. As the weeks passed, Sarah and David's relationship blossomed. It wasn't always easy, there were still moments of fear and doubt, as there always are in life, but this time, Sarah faced them head-on. She had learned to move through the fear, to embrace the unknown, and to take risks, not just in her creative life, but in her personal life as well. Together, they continued to explore new places, try new things, and challenge each other to grow. They both knew that life wasn't about playing it safe, it was about living fully, boldly, and without regret. One evening, as they sat on Sarah's balcony, watching the sunset, David turned to her and smiled. "You've come a long way, you know that," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling a sense of contentment she had never known before. "I couldn't have done it without Paris," she said softly. "And without you." David kissed the top of her head. You did it all yourself, Sarah. Paris was just the beginning. The rest, you've made that happen. Sarah smiled, knowing he was right. Paris had been the spark, but everything that had followed, the blog, the art, the relationship, it had all come from within her. She had taken the leap, and in doing so, she had found a life she never knew was possible. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There were still so many leaps to take, so many adventures to have, and she was ready for all of it. Because now she knew, life was meant to be lived boldly, one leap of faith at a time.